Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette séance pour célébrer la vie d'un des plus grands hommes irlandais de nos temps, John Hume. I'm Andy Pollak, and I'm going to introduce a short discussion where I've been asked just to limit it to 40 minutes since time is moving on. On my left is Maurice Fitzpatrick, the maker of this fine film, and on my right is one of Ireland's most eminent diplomats, Michael Lillis, who you've seen quite a bit of in the film, and the distinguished French historian of Ireland and biographer of John Hume, Pierre Joannon. A bit closer. If I could just very briefly be allowed a brief John Hume story. Everybody has their own John Hume story. I was a journalist in Belfast in the 1970s and 1980s, and I went back in the early 1990s to run a thing called the Uppsala Commission, which was an independent commission headed by a distinguished Norwegian human rights lawyer to try and ask ordinary people in the North for ideas about ways out of the dreadful deadlock that was still there in the North in the early 90s. And we talked to the politicians as well. And I rang John Hume, and as John always did, he was flying in and out of the country, and he said he was flying into Aldergrove on a particular evening, Belfast Aldergrove Airport, and we arranged to meet at a pub called the Chimney Corner Inn in Newton Abbey. Now, what's remarkable about the Chimney Corner Inn, it is in the middle of one of the most unionist parts of Northern Ireland. It's about 98% unionist. So I met John in the car park at the Chimney Corner, and we went into the pub. And John, glad-handed all around him. And it was, hello, Billy, and how are you, Lizzie, and how are you, Tommy? These were his adversaries. These were his enemies. And I was dumbstruck. And I tell that story to illustrate two things about John Hume. His enormous courage and his enormous skill, which we've seen in Washington, particularly in this film, at networking, at meeting people. So I'm going to start with Maurice as the filmmaker, and I've told the speakers that they can completely ignore my questions and say what they want to say. But for sake of keeping the thing going, I'm going to ask Maurice this question, if I can find it. Your film is primarily about Hume in America. It's about much more than that, but it's about Hume in America. But why was the American dimension? Why did it become so important to the Northern Ireland peace process and Hume's role in that dimension?
Yeah, so I think the quick answer is, why did it become so important, so fundamental to policy, is John Hume, as I've tried to show in the film. But why did Hume strike upon this strategy of going to America, and principally Washington, and as we're educating people, showing them that if you use your political clout in Northern Ireland, you can really change things? That came to me from a different story, actually, and a previous film and book called The Boys of St. Colum's. And that's John Hume's school, where in Derry, he went to St. Colum's College. And Hume still had enough of his health at that point to give an interview. And so I interviewed him for that film. And I heard it straight from what I'll call the fifth horse's mouth about his connections with Washington politicians and how important they were for him. And I thought that that was a remarkable thing in itself, the fact that this very busy man, and you've mentioned his engagement on the ground, Andy, and also in unionist areas, but you know, he was very, very committed to Derry, and of course he was then subsequently elected. Firstly, he was elected to the Parliament of Northern Ireland, but subsequently to London and to Europe. So he had a lot on his plate at any given time, and it was a very tense place to be a political figure in the North, as is seen in the film. So to manage to make time to go to America and to sustain those relationships, create them in the first place and sustain them, I thought that that was very noteworthy for such a busy professional politician to prioritize this, that I then wanted to discover how and why this happened. And to to be straight, there isn't actually a text you can go to. There isn't a book extant really that deals with this at all. So I set about trying to write the book and then make the film as well. That's how I came to the story. And Seamus Mallon, his Hume's dear friend and deputy leader for many years, 2 decades, refers to Hume being a kind of a lone wolf in some respects. Certainly in America, he was out there on his own, and even in politically sensitive times in the North, he would still find a way and a time to go out to America. And in the end, to come to your question, Andy, in the 1990s, it was absolutely crucial that when this president, in the form of Bill Clinton, was elected, and he was particularly well disposed towards Ireland, that he could, as he says himself, he could work with Congress on this. Congress was a well-honed machine at this point, and he could also pick out one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, of the United States congressmen, Senator George Mitchell, and say, listen, you're thinking about retiring, you're thinking about doing something different. I want you to go to Northern Ireland, and I want this to be shot across the bow to anyone who's in any way doubtful that I was using this to get elected, this Irish question. I want them to see that I mean this, and I want to consolidate peaceful initiatives in the North. So that's in many ways a culmination of decades and decades of John Hume's struggle to build this piece.
Maurice has written a book of the film. It's a fine book, brilliant book, very, very readable. John Hume in America. I highly recommend it. Michael, if I could ask a kind of version of the same question. It's a bit of a conundrum how an obscure politician from an obscure province could persuade 3 successive US presidents to support his analysis of this conflict and his proposals for getting out of it. How you've worked very closely with him. You were part of it. How do you explain that?
Well, I would say I think the most prominent feature of Hume's genius, and I always use the word genius, or I have been using it for some years, never in his hearing, by the way, but it was his extraordinary determination. Because the arc of his political life went through a whole series of extremely desperate moments. His first excursion into the United States, which happened in the 70s, came after the collapse of the Sunningdale Agreement. Sunningdale Agreement was the most hopeful event that had happened in Northern Ireland since partition of Ireland in 1922, 21 as well. It actually set up a system of power sharing by agreement between the Unionists and the Nationalists, which was unimaginable. But it was brought off largely by Hume's influence with the British. After internment, which was recorded very vividly in the film there, we had a situation of complete chaos. We had Bloody Sunday. There was despair on every side. But Hume got involved in selling his ideas on power sharing to the British, and they were adopted by Secretary of State Whitelaw in Whitelaw's white paper, and that became the Sunningdale briefly lived power sharing agreement, which was challenged by very, shall we say, traditional unionist, basic, I would say visceral opposition, particularly in the working class unionist circles in the Ulster workers' strike. It was the time government changed in Britain. Harold Wilson came in, replaced. The Tories had in the end actually been quite good on Ireland, to the surprise of most of us. But Harold Wilson came in, who was supposed to be friendly, and he was a disaster. He and the 2 successive Secretaries of State, Rees and Mason, they surrendered to the workers' strike and did nothing whatever to advance any political idea whatsoever for a period of 5 years. And they were 5 very, very bleak years. what did Hume do? He immediately launched completely original incentives, or initiatives, I should say. First one was the United States. And in approaching the United States, he didn't just do it in the traditional Irish nationalist way, which was to go and address the Dairymen's Association in Boston, or the GAA clubs in New York and the rest of it. He decided to get this is what Irish politicians have been doing for years, was going and meeting people who were happy to hear them, including to hear their gripes about the British and the rest of it. Hume went hell for leather for the top. And he was the first Irish nationalist leader to do that, ever. That hadn't happened in the 19th century. Even Parnell, who's been mentioned here, even De Valera, even Porrick Pierce. De Valera spent 2 years in the US, never got near the White House. Hume is a totally original thinker and was impatient with anything which wasn't going to be a complete success. That was his first initiative. And I had a great good fortune to be in Washington at that stage and was part of the effort, which finally ended up with the Carter Initiative. That is extraordinary film material there about Jimmy Carter, who's 90, what? I think he's 92. 92, brain tumor. His first interview he's given for years, which just shows that Hume is not the only person with determination. This fellow here is really quite extraordinary. But the second initiative, and I won't go into this in detail, was again totally original, was the New Ireland Forum, which was to bring together the constitutional nationalist politicians of the entire island and to give them an agenda, which was even more surprising than what he did in the United States, which was to get them to accept that the other side, the Unionists, had a legitimate identity, a legitimate right to have that identity be treated on an equal basis with the nationalist one. And he won their agreement to have that encapsulated in the New Ireland Forum report, and it has remained the centre of Irish nationalist approach to the problem with the British and with everybody else ever since. So the essence of what I would say, in answer to your question, is that Hume was so determined, almost to a point of, I wouldn't say insanity, because the man is one of the most intelligent and soft-spoken, I think you may have noticed that in the film, one of the most soft-spoken politicians you'll ever meet, but it was just adamantine determination, and that's how I would sum up Mr. Hume.
Thanks, Michael. Pierre, the film is mainly about the American dimension of Hume's search for peace in Northern Ireland, but there, of course, was an important European dimension as well.
Yes, indeed, and I think this remarkable film is totally incomplete. There should be a second film, John Hume and Europe, because John had the idea not only of lobbying in the States and reaching the upper levels of American society. He had also the intention of doing exactly the same thing in Europe. And in 1977, he was appointed special advisor to Richard Burke, who was at the time the Irish commissioner in Brussels, at the commission in Brussels. And 2 years later, he was elected as member of the European Parliament, and he was going to be elected ever since. And from that standpoint in Europe, he was very keen to influence the statesmen, the opinion makers, the commission, all the person who needed to understand the Northern Ireland conflict in order to intervene on the positive side. And he was doing that in a way that was very, very total and comprehensive, in the sense that in 1977, the same year that he entered as a special advisor to Richard Burke, I invited him to attend a session of the International Peace Academy in Menton in the south of France. And that was the first of many encounters, because I invited him about 10 times and he was very keen on coming to explain to various audiences in that particular instance. It was diplomats, international civil servants, opinion makers, university professors specialized in peace restoring, peacekeeping, and he was very keen on explaining in front of these people the conflict of Northern Ireland. And I was making sure at every time that I was inviting him to invite other people, unionist people. Certainly I wanted a unionist presence so that they might talk behind the scene. And behind the Northern Ireland scene, I thought that to be in the sun on the Mediterranean Sea would make things easier, maybe, for unionists to melt down and for nationalists to melt down as well in bathing trunks. It worked to a certain extent, not too much, but anyway, in the end, I think that John succeeded in convincing the Europeans as he had convinced the Americans, and this at the upper echelons, so that in the end, I mean, Europe was there to support the Good Friday Agreement. And I mean, that was very important, but it was not only in John's mind essential to talk to the Europeans to enlist their support. It was very important for him to convince the Northern Ireland people on both sides that Europe was a model. Europe had been built to foster an understanding and reconciliation between France and Germany. That was the first reason for building a European ideal. And John always said, if France and Germany have been able to reconcile themselves after 3 wars, we can do it exactly the same way in Northern Ireland. And not only was European a model in that sense, but it was also a model in the institutional sense, because all the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, I am talking under the control of Michael, are modeled on the European institution. So, I mean, John was walking on 2 legs, 1 American leg, 1 European leg.
Michael, if I could just ask you a question. You mentioned Sunningdale and the collapse of the Sunningdale initiative in the mid-70s. One of the core of Hume's strategy was that the 2 communities in Northern Ireland couldn't find a way out of their deadlock by themselves. They needed help from Dublin, from London, and of course from Washington. And so it proved in the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which you had a very big part in, and the Good Friday Agreement. I just want to bring you up to date. How much is that still the case as we try to tackle the much smaller but still serious deadlock currently between Sinn Féin and the DUP in Northern Ireland?
I would sum up my answer to your question by saying I'm actually quite worried about the situation. I think most people in Ireland who follow it very closely on all sides would have worries, slightly varying depending on where you're coming from. Obviously, the big issue is Brexit. I couldn't sufficiently agree with what Pierre has said. If you look at Hume's speeches for years, from the very beginning, and there's a collection of them recently been published called John Hume in His Own Words by Sean Ferran, which is well worth looking at, you will be struck by the recurrence of a number of themes. Obviously, power sharing, non-violence, but one of the dominant and most repeated themes is the European Union. Exactly as Pierre has described it, as a model for peace, as a demonstration of what human beings can do to overcome ancient hatreds and a great deal of violence. And it is the overarching framework for the Good Friday Agreement. Britain and Ireland, both members of the European Union, you heard Tony Blair mentioning that as an important element, and it is a hugely important element. And the fact that Britain is going to leave the European Union is actually making this whole structure a little bit less, shall we say, stubbornly robust. In fact, it's it's a worry. What makes it even worse, I'm sorry to say, I'm going to give you a recital now of negatives after saying some, I hope, positive things earlier. The next thing is Mrs. Thatcher, Mrs. May, excuse me. I think Mrs. Thatcher, curiously enough, stood behind the Anglo-Irish Agreement in the face of the most violent reaction, which came from the Loyalists. And she was implacable in her steady loyalty in keeping the thing going. I got to know her a little bit. I mean, she's not a popular figure in Ireland. I don't know if she's a popular figure in France, but she was a model in the whole history of this dilemma of once she made an agreement, she stuck to it and she defended it, and she was not going to be put off by it, by any sort of opposition. Mrs. May, unfortunately, has not been as strong. Mrs. May, when she lost her majority in the British electorate, made a deal with the one party which basically, let's face it, dislikes the Good Friday Agreement, voted against it, has always represented a particularly recalcitrant and negative attitude to negotiation, to peace, to reconciliation. And she didn't actually have to do that. People perhaps don't understand this because her defenders will say, what else would she do? She needed their votes, but she didn't. Why is that the case? Because the one fear that the DUP have, even more than Mrs. Thatcher, is that Mr. Corbyn could be the next Prime Minister. So there's no way that the DUP were going to vote against any of her policies if, by doing so, Mr. Corbyn came into power. Because in the DUP view, he is the ultimate traitor because of his past associations, particularly with Sinn Féin. She has done that, and it has really created a crisis because the effect of it, very simply, is that the DUP, the most negative party in Northern Ireland, now has a veto on British government policy on Northern Ireland. When you use those words, you actually begin to see how dangerous this is. And then the third element, which I see as being, I'm not going to finish in despair here, but the third element that's very difficult is the way that Sinn Féin, who are now the majority nationalist party, for the reasons that Bill Clinton explained very clearly in that film, the way they are handling the situation in Northern Ireland is making it even more difficult than it has been for years to promote reconciliation. Whether we like it or not, the simple fact is that Sinn Féin are seen by the Unionists as the IRA. There might be nicer ways of saying that, but they would not be the truth. That is a simple, crude fact. And it's extremely difficult to promote reconciliation on that basis, extremely. Instead of being very careful, showing a bit of sensitivity, unfortunately Sinn Féin seem to take every opportunity to glorify the campaign of the IRA, which is supposed to have been eliminated and we're not going to talk about it anymore. It's happening day in, day out, and frankly creating more problems. So we have a difficult situation. I think the positive London is not playing this game the right way. DUP are not playing the game in the way that we'd like them, the Unionists, to play it, and they're the power party on that side. Sinn Féin, the most important party on the nationalist side now, are not being helpful either. So, my own conclusion is that we're probably going to have a difficult period here. I think a lot depends now, perhaps more now than it has done for a long time in the past, on the Irish government, on politics in the South, because there is a more mature attitude in Dublin, both on the part of the main government party and the main opposition party, than there is on either side in Northern Ireland, and I'm sorry to say, than there is in London. But I think that we have good leadership in both the main parties, and it is for them to fight for the survival of the Good Friday Agreement. And I'm actually confident that they will do that, but I think we're going to have a difficult period.
Okay, before I throw it open to a couple of questions from the audience, I'm just going to ask two short general questions for any of the speakers to pick up. First of all, Seamus Mallon compared Hume to O'Connell and Parnell. I'd like to ask if you agree with that. And the second one is, given that Hume is now ill and therefore invisible, is there a danger that he will be forgotten, his arguments will be forgotten, and they will be replaced by what Michael is talking about, which is the Sinn Féin narrative, which is a narrative of dominance and takeover as Sinn Féin become by far the most important nationalist party. So those two questions.
Yes, well, it's funny that you are asking this question, because yesterday I was lecturing a group of French people on Irish history and literature, and one question which was put to me was, in your history of Ireland, you are mentioning O'Connell and Parnell as the uncrowned king of Ireland. And they asked me, they said, who in contemporary Ireland would deserve to be called the uncrowned king of Ireland? And I had no hesitation. I said John Hume. There was absolutely no doubt. O'Connell succeeded in getting the emancipation of Catholics all over the United Kingdom, which was a fantastic achievement. Parnell got near the home rule for Ireland, which was also something absolutely amazing. And John Hume achieved peace in Northern Ireland. So definitely he needs the title, the crown on his head. Now we, especially in France, we know that the crowns are very often falling from one's head and the head with it, as a matter of fact. So are we to ask ourselves, will the crown stay on John's head? Well, I hope so. And as a friend and a long time supporter of John, I can tell you that I am absolutely infuriated by the tendency that I see in some press organs, some media, and some spokesperson who are suggesting that Sinn Féin invented the peace process. I mean, it was particularly clear at the moment of the death of Martin McGuinness. Well, Martin McGuinness deserves credit for a lot of things, but he doesn't deserve credit for having invented the peace process, and Sinn Féin doesn't deserve at all the credit for having invented the peace process. They had the courage to jump in the wagon, and we should be thankful for that, but it's John, definitely, who engineered the peace process and who should get the whole credit for it.
Yeah, and I think the comment that Eamon McCann makes towards the very end of the film, where he still lives in the Bogside in Derry and he hears these guides telling the story of the history of the Bogside, and suddenly Hume crops up out of nowhere in the mid or late 80s. And Eamon's reaction to that is, I find, very interesting, because in no way is Eamon McCann party prix. He was actually quite a political rival to John Hume down the years. In no way was he part of John Hume's political party. He's reacting here to something, it's very human, and he's got a sense of injustice. And he's also got a sense of, Pierre, you'll know very well in the writing of history, there's cause and effect, and you can't just simply paint things as having happened without their roots. We have to understand where the roots are. So there's quite a degree of fury among people who are there making things happen in the 60s, 70s, and then they see that this is just completely erased or painted over. Also, the latest hijacking is the civil rights movement, and Sinn Féin's claim that, among certain members of Sinn Féin, claiming that they were the progenitors of the civil rights movement, but people like Bernadette Devlin and Eamon McCann, again, were very vocal in their condemnation of this. So there is a very conscious rewriting of history happening, And then you also, let's remember the process of time. To what extent are kids in Derry or in the north of Ireland or throughout the whole country, to what extent are they aware that these things happen unless they're in a very deliberate way told? So I was very determined in this film to start in the 60s and really stay there for a good while, the 70s, build it all up into the 90s. The 90s was, as I've said before, a culmination of many processes, but only can be properly understood, I would suggest, by looking at those original principles that John Hume wrote and others supported him in that.
I agree with all those comments.
Okay.
And I can talk for hours on this subject, but
Talk for another minute or two.
no, I would say I would disagree with the comparison in a sense, because there was a poll conducted. I mean, polls are vulgar things and they shouldn't be taken seriously, I know that. But there was a poll conducted about 8 years ago by the National Broadcasting Organisation in Ireland called Radio Télévision. And those of you who are French haven't had the pleasure of enjoying its products, which are very good, by the way. But they conducted a national poll over several months to discover, in the opinion of the viewers and listeners, who was the most important person in Irish history. And this went back to Brian Boru. It included Daniel O'Connell. It included Parnell. It included Bono, by the way. And Michael Collins. And overwhelmingly, people agreed that it was John Hume. So to that extent, I disagree that this comparison stands. I think John Hume has actually been a more important figure historically than either of those two other great leaders of ours.
Okay, quick summation of the two questions: the absence of John Hume in this film, and how did I address that fact that he's not in it as a full participant? And the second question being Laura Lough featuring in the film. Just it's a border area, and indeed that's where I'm from. I'm from Belturbet, County Cavan, and that waterway. I mean, it starts to emerge, as you say, in the middle of the film, and I recall talking at some length with the editor, and we said we're going to do this. We're going to introduce a water motif, and I said I know just the place. We were editing in Dublin, and it was a very intense, a lot of hard work. 7 days. It felt like 7 days and 7 nights. And we said, okay, well, we're going to go up to Belturbet and do some water shots there in the open boat. The boatman is my dad, Seamus Fitzpatrick. Kept it really local. And that architectural folly, that little island with a little, it looks like the front of a castle or something, a tiny little castle, that's bang on the border. That's an outlier of Crom Castle. And it was built merely as just something to look at for the gentry who occupied Crom Castle, and it's bang on the border now. And I was saying to the crew when we were filming, over there, just turn left, and you've got the south of Ireland, and turn right, you've got the north, and it just seemed to me to be right then to use that Heaney poem over it as well, and I think when you hit upon something that seems correct, I think my instincts anyway would be not to interrogate them too deeply. Just run with them, put them up on a screen, see if it works. If you're happy with it, just run with that. So yeah, the other question. Sorry, I've answered your questions in reverse. But the other question about John, interesting is one word. I was bedeviled by this. What do I do? The fact that John Hume is still with us. He's 81 years old, but he can't really be a full participant. He can't do an interview. So I even at time of production, I didn't have a solution to that. Didn't want to omit him, couldn't include him in a full way. So what do you do? So I discussed it with Pat, and that area where we filmed John it's a little walkway between where they live. They have a weekend place in Moville, just outside Moville, and it goes towards the Moville town. And John was John that day. He's his usual self, and he kept saying, "Hurry up!" And we didn't detain him too long. But I did think then again, you put it up on screen. How does it look? And you put it in monochrome and so on. And I did think that was the way to go with trying to capture John Hume today.
Okay, one more question there at the back, in the back row.
Absolutely crucial. People in Washington as well would tell me that Hume would always characterize himself as an educator. I'm a teacher. And he was very, very happy with that designation. A teacher of French and history as well. Those were his two subjects. He was extremely comfortable in France, as you know, Pierre, and with the French language and so on. But that's definitely where he started. And he was also sharply aware that had he been born just 1 year later, he would have missed that exam, the 11+ you mentioned, which was the exam you needed to pass to get into a place like St. Columb's College. And he just thought, well, you know, this is, even in his Nobel lecture, he talks about accidents of birth. He knew he was he was born into a very deprived environment, but he was, at least this was the Promethean gift, the welfare state in Britain, that education was available to people who managed to pass this exam and get on into university. And once that happened, it was an irreversible momentum. And people were, you know, aware I think particularly in Derry and in the Bogside, they were aware that this would have political consequences. So what's amazing to me when I look at John Hume in his early 20s, he emerges somehow as, I don't know how exactly, except to explain it that way, but he emerges as a full-blown politician, political leader, civil rights leader, almost as though he's been doing this for decades. He's quite amazing in the way he's thinking things through. And the first speech his wife ever heard him make was in 1959 in Derry, and a speech advocating that Ireland should join the European Common Market. So again, the importance of Europe was always there. And he, you know, was at the age of 22, and it was a full 14 years before Ireland and GB joined hands and joined, and but Hume was advocating that from the get-go. So yeah, he was always thinking things through, looking at the northern issue in a broader historical context, and I think he'd be very, very happy to be just simply considered a teacher. And I'm going to end now, but in the brief period when he was formerly was a teacher in St. Columb's College, he would organize debates in the evening with Protestant schools and bring them along, and he would try and get people to think anew of the political stasis that they had inherited. And he would even provoke people as school kids in St. Columb's College and say, well, why don't you join the Unionist Party and reform it from within? Which would have been just unthinkable. Join the Unionist Party, no. But he's trying to get them to think we have to invent a new politics. The old anti-partitionist line of the Nationalist Party, that's not working. The Unionist Party, for obvious reasons, is a spent force. It's not fit for purpose at all. We need to do something new. So he was always trying to educate people, and the Latin root, I believe, of it, the word education is to bring out from within. He was trying to get them to see how they could become agents of change.
Yes, if I may add, another side to your question is the fact that being a former teacher, John knew how to impose his ideas by repeating them endlessly. And he was very often criticized. People were saying, it's Hume speak. We have heard this speech for many, many times. It's the 1,000 times he says the same thing. And one day I was discussing this with him, and he says, don't forget that I am a teacher. And being a teacher, I know very well that to get the ideas in the head of the pupils, you have to hammer them again, again, and again. And in the end, he succeeded. The teacher, Hume speak was spoken by Bill Clinton. Hume speak was spoken by the British Prime Minister. Hume speak was spoken by the Taoiseach. Hume speak was spoken by everybody, even sometimes by the unionists.
You want one last word about anything to do with Hume, Michael, before we close?
I heard, because I worked very closely with Hume over the years, both as a diplomat until I left the service, so brilliantly represented here today by our ambassador in Paris. But I left that in 1990. But since then, I remain close to him and saw him very frequently. And I frequently, over the years, have attended this, what was called in Irish journalism, the single transferable John Hume speech. I have never heard him deliver the single transferable John Hume speech without the audience being completely and absolutely electrified. He speaks very quietly. He doesn't do this sort of roaring and screaming stuff that some of our politicians do. None of yours do, of course, but never mind. But his impact, regardless of the degree of repetition, and it was never, and I observed him writing speeches closely over the years. Sometimes, and he would always, when he was going to deliver an important speech, his party conference, something in the House of Commons, or something in the European Parliament, he would actually sit for 2 hours and would not be accessible to anybody, even to his wife. He would, or to anyone, any close advisor, he would just be silent and totally serious. And he worked the speech out in his mind first, and then he regularly wrote it, but it was extremely deliberate, and it was always effective. So he was able to achieve a greater tense attention than any politician that I've ever heard. And, he knew what he was doing, that man. So I leave it at that, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.